we'll be implementing that. All right, here we
Awesome.
are, everybody. Welcome back, Psychedelics Today. This is one of our Vital conversation series. Vital is coming up soon. If you want to learn from our 12-month program, check that out, vitalpsychedelictraining.com. I'm joined today by Mason Marks. How are you today, Mason?
Good. Nice to see you, Joe.
Yeah, likewise. You were on a recent episode of ours, so I'm actually happy to get you back so soon for a live stream because things are moving really quickly in America, it seems like, and it's really hard for even us to track everything that's going on. So I couldn't imagine for, the average person, they just don't really have a clue what's going on. So the first thing we want to talk about is the article you wrote recently about a pending friction between the federal apparatus with MDMA, psilocybin, et cetera, and a lot of these state initiatives. Can you lay us out a little bit about this article you had published in JAMA?
Yeah, thanks. So this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, came out December 8th. It's called State Regulated Psychedelics on a Collision Course with FDA. And it takes a closer look at what might potentially be in the future for some of these state regulated programs and points out how they're very different from medical cannabis or adult use cannabis. But specifically focusing on medical use, I think a lot of people think that the similar legal issues will be raised by state regulated psychedelic programs. And I think it's far more complicated than that. I think one of the assumptions that are often made by people who promote ballot initiatives in the states is that the federal government, the various federal agencies, the Department of Justice, the DEA, the Food and Drug Administration, that they will extend the same courtesy to state-regulated psychedelic programs that they've extended to cannabis programs. There's sort of this uneasy peace that exists. The federal government is able to intervene. It has the discretion to intervene and shut down dispensaries if it wants to, but there's kind of this truce that exists that could change at any moment, especially if we have a new president who's less tolerant of these Schedule I controlled substances. So I think that assumption is not necessarily a very good one to make, especially because if you look at medical cannabis programs, the healthcare professionals have very little involvement. They don't actually dispense marijuana. There's no marijuana in the clinic. It's really just a recommendation. So even the language that's used is different. They're not writing a prescription for marijuana. It's a recommendation. And it's been viewed as a First Amendment free speech right of these professionals to make that recommendation. But when it comes to the actual cannabis, the patients have to go to a dispensary. And so there's total kind of like, there's separation between the healthcare system and the marijuana dispensaries. That sort of buffer, those boundaries don't exist in state regulated psychedelics, except to some extent in Oregon, where the law is very clear that there's this legal separation between supported adult use of psilocybin and conventional healthcare. So the facilitators that are monitoring clients while they experience the effects of psilocybin, they're prohibited from making medical claims. They're not able to diagnose or treat health conditions. They can't operate within a healthcare facility. And if they are a licensed healthcare professional, like a nurse or physician or a clinical psychologist, they can't exercise any of the privileges of that license when they're acting as a psilocybin facilitator. So they have to kind of like take off their healthcare professional hat, put on the facilitator hat. Those limitations don't exist in the Colorado program, though. So the facilitators can make medical claims. They can operate within a healthcare facility. And the Natural Medicine Advisory Board and the governing agencies, DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, and DOR, the Department of Revenue, they seem very intent on creating a medical program that doesn't have these very clear distinctions. So I think that opens up the healthcare professionals and the entire state regulated program to some legal risk. You're muted, Joe.
Appreciate that. Clear my throat. So in Oregon, it's pretty clear this is not a clinical framework. That's what the voters kind of included there. And in Colorado, it looks like they've included substantially more clinical framing. So the biggest collision, I think, from what you and I discussed was around DEA licensure, um, and how some clinicians, prescribers could be putting their DEA license at risk in some cases. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we discussed in the episode. In this article, I go into a little more of a medical direction, talking about the FDA, and there's some recent news that's very relevant. You may have heard that the DEA sent a warning letter to Georgia pharmacists, warning them not to dispense medical cannabis. So Georgia has a very unusual medical marijuana law that allows pharmacies to dispense it, unlike other
Wow.
states where it's a dispensary. There's no pharmacist or medical professionals involved. So there was something about that crossed the threshold of acceptable blending of marijuana and the medical system. Something about that triggered the DEA to send those letters. And it sends a signal that perhaps even the cannabis industry isn't as safe as many people believe it to be. But if you look at other actions of the federal government recently, like the Food and Drug Administration sent a warning letter really to warn patients about off-label prescribing of ketamine and compounding of ketamine formulations. That's something that's really perfectly legal, and also ketamine is FDA approved. And even then, the FDA is getting a bit ruffled by the off-label use. So, and also the FDA sends dozens of letters over the past few years. There have been dozens of warning letters sent to CBD companies that make THC products, warning them not to make medical claims. And same with kratom, same with stem cell treatments. So if the FDA is willing to send these warning letters regarding legal drugs like ketamine, things that are fully legal like kratom, and then cannabis, I think there's a good chance it might have similar problems, perhaps even more of an issue with psilocybin that's being administered in these like service centers or healing centers.
Mm, that's interesting. Do you um, do you expect the feds won't really step up and do anything, at least in Colorado, until after implementation of the legal frame?
That's a good question because you have the personal use side of the program in operation, and you do have groups that are offering psilocybin to people as a gift. They're providing
Mm,
education or harm reduction, and then providing psilocybin mushrooms as a gift, which is permitted to some extent under the personal use side of the Natural Medicine Health Act and the amendment SB 290 that was implemented this year. So the question is, will the federal government get involved prior to 2025 when the regulated supported adult use or medical use program comes online? And I don't know. I suppose it depends on what happens in the intervening time. But in terms of the medical program that they're creating that will probably open sometime in mid 2025, I would estimate. I don't think we'd see anything until then. They'll probably
mhm.
wait and see. And there hasn't been anything happening in Oregon just yet, but the program's still pretty small at this point, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, nobody's really making enough money for it to be like, let's make an example of you, is my sense. But you never know. This stuff is all roll of the dice, and we'll
Yeah.
see how it goes. To the best of your knowledge, is there any sort of like legal defense fund that groups have put together in the event the feds crack down on some of these organizations?
I'm not
Or
aware of anything like
Mhm.
that. I've heard it come up. Maybe it was you who mentioned it. I don't know. I heard someone mention it. Sometime in the past year, I've heard someone mention that offhand, but I haven't heard anything about it.
Right. It would be probably smart if somebody could spin up some sort of industry association that would allow for that kind of insurance, some sort of like old-timey mutual insurance kind of thing. As long as you're playing by the rules, you can get access to that insurance pot in the event you need it, something like that. But I'll let people figure that out because I'm not taking those risks yet.
Well, there is this federal bill that was introduced by Earl Blumenauer and some other legislators I can't recall right now. And then there's a name for it. I can't remember. It's like Heal or Hope or something like that. And it would effectively try to codify sort of a Cole memo for state psilocybin programs. I don't think it has any chance of passing because Congress has been trying to implement marijuana reform for like over a decade and nothing's happened. So I don't think that would get support, but people are thinking about it, trying to protect these programs. I'm not even sure if it's a good idea to do that because you and I spoke a little bit about some of the power dynamics that are emerging. And, some of these programs, I think, are spending an awful lot of taxpayer money. Oregon, for example, it was promised during the campaign in 2020 to become self-sufficient by this year. But the Oregon Health Authority ran out of money. It had to ask the state for over $6 million to run the program for the next 2 years. They got half that, 3.1 million, but they're already in the red for millions of dollars. Colorado, I'm sure, will cost at least as much. And so you have states making these big gambles on these state regulated programs. And so there's a lot of money at stake. There's legal risk for professionals and for businesses and even for clients to some extent, I mean, technically. And I think a lot of that's being done just kind of on the hope that there won't be any backlash.
Yeah.
I think what Oregon's doing is actually smart. I think the way you want to do this is be very clear about separating this out from healthcare in any way. This is not meant to be a medical intervention or therapeutic intervention.
What are you hearing from physicians who are not necessarily true believers, we'll call it, in psychedelics? Like, what are prescribers saying about what's happening or what will be happening in Colorado?
There are some professionals that want to get involved in the industry. So they're very, some people are very supportive. And I think they are trying to figure out what it means for them and their professional licenses and their potential legal liability. But for the most part, if you were to ask healthcare professionals, I think they would say, this is working its way through the FDA. Let's wait until there's evidence to show that this is a safe and efficacious therapeutic intervention. And I know that for sure. I mean, even the American Medical Association has taken a position that psychedelics shouldn't be used therapeutically until there's more evidence.
Right. Yeah, a lot of commentary we could make there, but let's keep moving.
Yeah.
All right. So, are there any other big fireworks you would expect in this kind of federal versus state clash that people might want to stay aware of?
I think the most immediate concern is the making medical claims, because that's something that where the FDA has shown a lot of interest in getting involved. Even the Federal Trade Commission is very interested in misleading medical claims and has partnered with the FDA to crack down on that in the cannabis sector. So that's probably something that could happen most easily and quickly. The FDA has made attempts to shut down stem cell clinics in Florida and California. So I could see that happening for psilocybin service centers or healing centers in Colorado. And the FDA was successful in Florida. In California, they ran into a real obstacle, and there was a federal judge that stopped the FDA and protected the stem cell clinic's ability to continue operating under the argument that they were practicing medicine, not regulating drugs, not producing drugs. That they were, the FDA was attempting to regulate the practice of medicine. So you could ask whether state psychedelic programs could win on a similar type of argument. And it's anybody's guess. It could go either way.
Briefly, because I went through that process a few years back, an injury, or decided I preferred the stem cell option over the surgical option for one situation. And the regulation was such that the biological material pulled out of your own body needs to be out of your body for less than 24 hours before it's considered some sort of drug that could be a regulated thing. And that was the process. So they've developed all sorts of interesting workarounds using Caribbean countries and whatnot, similar to our industry. And people honestly, if you're curious about how this might play out, you should look at industries like stem cells for analogies that could be really instructive on how you might want to do business. It's going to be really strange for sure once the feds start paying attention.
Yeah. And I think once you have FDA approved psychedelic treatments, which is not a given. I mean, most people expect MDMA to be approved sometime next year. That might not happen, or we'll see. I wouldn't assume that it will. I think this is a very unusual type of request being made of the FDA by MAPS, because MAPS is really pushing for approval of the psychological support or therapy or whatever you want to call it, along with the drug. And no one really knows how the FDA will respond to that. But at some point, we'll have FDA approved psychedelics, whether it's psilocybin, MDMA, or something else. And you have to wonder how that's going to fit in with the Oregon program. In this article in JAMA, I talk about how you could end up having FDA approved psilocybin offered in this very same, on the same street, in the same building, or even in the same facility as state regulated non-FDA approved psilocybin. And it could get very confusing for consumers. And, what are you getting, the Compass FDA approved psilocybin or the sort of, the Boulder, Colorado variety?
Yeah, I'd take either. So we have a quick question. How would you define medical claim? Is it like how? Yeah, what do you mean there specifically?
That's a very good question, because I think a lot of people in Oregon, for example, are saying, well, we're not saying this is medical necessarily, but it's still therapeutic. The FDA would still consider that to be a medical claim, as would the FTC. So I think there are some companies in Oregon that are making medical claims. They're making I don't think there's a difference legally between a medical claim and a therapeutic claim from the perspective of these federal agencies.
Like this will help your anxiety kind of thing, or this will make your PTSD better, things like that.
Yeah, yeah. And so you don't have to be saying this is a medical intervention for your PTSD. It doesn't have to be worded. There's no magic words, as we would say in the legal profession, to be making a medical claim. You just really have to be saying that this will improve some kind of condition. But the position of the Oregon Health Authority has been that the state doesn't regulate that term therapeutic. And so they're kind of hiding behind that a little bit. But I think it's potentially a bit careless of them. They're a public health agency. I think they have the authority to regulate those claims that are being made. And I think they should, because they're smart to create those boundaries and the rules. And they really are literally sort of daring these agencies to. You don't want the FDA sending a warning letter to an Oregon psilocybin service center. That would be everywhere in the news. That is exactly. This is the funny thing. Some of these groups that lobby in Oregon and Colorado, they're so afraid of a single adverse event being reported in the news media, which is bound to happen at some point. But meanwhile, their portrayal of the Oregon program as therapeutic, I think, is really taunting the agencies to send this kind of a warning letter.
That's really wild. And yeah, people should pay attention to that. And I really hope service centers start playing a little more carefully to avoid that. In my in my ideological tradition, Mason, one of my heroes in the psychology space was incarcerated. Wilhelm Reich, for making really strange devices that the FDA thought were medical. He was pretty much making medical claims, and he did some serious damn time. So people should definitely be careful and watch out for the FDA, especially if you're going further with your claims than the feds really want you to.
And there have been cases of the Department of Justice going after compounding pharmacies, for example. The cases I've seen have involved potential contamination, but they certainly could. The FDA and other agencies could go and inspect these psilocybin manufacturers in Oregon or in Colorado when they open, and they could slap them with all kinds of potential violations and make things very difficult for them.
Mm. Um, let's see. We have another question, and we can jump to Massachusetts if you don't mind. So this is us forecasting. Neither of us really probably likes forecasting. I think we're going to see continued business growth, but I don't think it's going to be as rapid as it was before. I think there could be some sort of Colorado feeding frenzy in preparation of 2025, but I think based on the results in Oregon, maybe it'll be more tempered because people were making some big gambles in Oregon. What do you think, Mason?
Yeah, there's definitely been a slowing of momentum in some ways. You can see that in the MAPS conference. Psychedelic Science obviously was a huge, massive event, but some of the events held since then have been much smaller. The Horizons New York event was canceled, at the last minute, and the microdose event, the Wonderland Miami event, I think was much smaller, kind of pared down event compared to previous years. And so I think there is a little bit of, slowed enthusiasm, but yeah, I think Colorado is going to be a huge epicenter as the agencies get closer to making rules. And there's going to be, I think that feeding frenzy that you describe, we might see something like that. I think it could potentially be a much, much bigger industry than in Oregon.
For sure. Yeah. As usual, I want to urge people some caution. I had some friends lose substantial money in Oregon. I kind of refused to throw big money into Oregon early because it just looked risky. So I didn't do it, even though I'm here. So you could also be taking substantial risks in Colorado as well. Somebody's trying to suggest that Horizons Northwest wasn't canceled, and that is accurate, though the New York City one was, which is the first time in a very long time they didn't have it. And he says he doesn't want my industry. It's great. All right, so let's talk about Massachusetts. So what's going on there? Recently, Provincetown actually passed a decriminalization bill. Is that right?
Yes, this is the 7th city in Massachusetts to decriminalize, or more specifically, deprioritize the enforcement of criminal penalties related to psychedelics. And that's really meaningful because Massachusetts for quite some time has led the nation in the number of cities that have decriminalized. And this just further extends that lead. California is the closest state with 5 cities that have decriminalized. So Massachusetts really has been this bastion of decriminalization policy. Salem, Massachusetts was another one of the more recent cities. And then, of course, just this month, Providence. But what was so unique about the Providence Select Board is the body that regulates their resolution called upon state lawmakers to replace the 2024 ballot initiative that is supported by the New Approach PAC. And the legislature has the opportunity to do that. They can amend or replace a ballot initiative and enact it. And then if they don't, it goes back to the voters, or the campaign has to collect some more signatures, but it's a nominal amount. So there was a very interesting meeting where Bay Staters for Natural Medicine made a presentation to the select board, and they were persuaded to support that in a I think it was a 3-1 vote, with one person abstaining because she said she supported this, but in a medical, a more controlled setting.
That's interesting. So Bay Staters has done a lot of work in Massachusetts. They've been effectively the primary force behind this city by city decriminalization project, right? Is that right?
They would tell you that they're really part of this coalition that contains many organizations. I don't remember the number, but I think it's several dozen. Some that I know of that come to mind are New England Veterans for Plant Medicine and Parents for Plant Medicine. But they yeah, they've been a primary driver, Bay Staters, behind these city efforts dating back years to Somerville, which was the first city there.
It's funny. It's deep roots there. Fascinating. So what? So from what I understand, New Approach is deploying some funds and resources to Massachusetts to help steer at the state level, similar to what was happening from New Approach in Colorado and Oregon. Um, and I think you said the person's name in charge is Jared Moffat. Is there anything substantially different around what they're hoping to do from the New Approach side in Massachusetts?
I think it's tough to say for a couple reasons. One thing I'd note is in the law itself, the ballot initiative text, it says the heading for the regulated program is non-medically prescribed psychedelics. So they're trying to make clear that this is not, operating through the conventional healthcare prescription kind of route. But everything that I've heard from the campaign, it's all very medical rhetoric. It suggests that they want to create something more similar to Colorado than to Oregon. So that's my understanding. There's also a sort of a summary of the ballot initiative language that was approved by the Attorney General's office. That, however, has no medical language at all, and it looks more like an adult use program, supported adult use. So again, we have this kind of discordance between the text of the initiative itself and what the campaign and the people behind it are kind of advertising it as. One of the complaints of Bay Staters was that they say that they've seen the signature gatherers misrepresenting the ballot initiative, saying something like vote for access to mental health therapies for veterans or something, very abbreviated message. And there were similar claims made in Colorado about the techniques, I guess, taken by signature gatherers. So that's one issue. I know that another big part of the initiative is it sets up an entirely new agency, which hasn't been done before. So this would be a whole new psychedelic commission that would regulate psychedelics in the state. And I'd be curious to know what you think of this, but one of the arguments that Bay Staters is making to replace the ballot initiative is that it doesn't allow local opt-out like Colorado. So in Oregon, under Measure 109, cities and counties could opt out of the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act. So if they didn't want to have service centers in their city or county, they could vote on that. And most cities and counties that voted on it did opt out. And New Approach changed that language in Colorado so that local jurisdictions cannot opt out. And so that's an argument Bay Staters is making. They want a replacement that allows for local ability to opt out.
It's so hard, right? It's so hard. I saw the rhetoric against it in Colorado from a lot of the red municipalities and counties, and it was pretty gut-wrenching, the language they were using. And I can kind of see how, and this has been a constant dynamic in Colorado forever, right? Like Boulder, Denver, where I live, have huge voting power relative to the rest of the state, just based on population density. And there's huge geographies in Colorado that do not want anything resembling kind of leftist or progressive values. They want very traditional, kind of rural Republican values. And I kind of understand where they're coming from with that. And, forcing counties to allow it, on one hand, feels unfair. On the other hand, it's like, if we really believe in this, we don't want poor people living in those areas to not have access. So it's a really complex issue, in my opinion. If the state votes on something, the state should implement something on one hand. On the other hand, maybe there's just an extraordinary values mismatch. But But in Massachusetts, I don't really see that happening, right? Like Massachusetts, they've been tripping for a long time. And I think there's, I used to live there. I used to own a house there. So like I kind of know the scene all over the state. Um, so perhaps, I don't know. Bay Staters has probably done the work to understand this more than I have. So I'm just shooting off the cuff here. So I would say in Massachusetts, I would think that's mostly okay. But again, like we have to understand, like, are we restricting access by restricting people, by placing restrictions on municipalities? And yeah, someone would need to do a detailed cost benefit analysis there and do some substantial polling in Massachusetts before, knowing what the right move is for Massachusetts, in my opinion. I don't have access to that data. I'm sure New Approach has that data. I don't know that Bay Staters does, but maybe you do. Maybe you're right. Maybe we should get them on to discuss this.
I think you should, yeah. And I don't know what my opinion is on that necessarily, that particular issue, and I don't know what traction it will get in Massachusetts either. I should say though that the primary objections, I think, of Bay Staters are that this is going to create, the New Approach ballot initiative will create another expensive program that costs the state millions of dollars, is not actually accessible, and privileges, maybe a small number of businesses and interests. So they have, it's a little unclear to me whether they're crafting replacement language from scratch or if they're hoping to swap in one of the existing proposals. They have Democratic lawmakers that have more of a decrim approach. And then they have a Republican lawmaker who has a regulated program, but it sets license fees very low at $155 twice a year. So compared to the $2,000 that facilitators pay in Oregon, or $10,000 for a service center, that would be obviously much more affordable. And then it's supposed to be sort of a little bit of a pared down requirements to get the licensure. So I'm not sure if they have something entirely new that they're working on, or if they want to swap one of those in. But I think that's their primary concern is community education and making sure that people can access kind of on their own terms. And it was very interesting. The Providence select board meeting was very interesting because one of the members was sort of talking about
Providence, Rhode Island, Mason, or
Provincetown.
Provincetown?
Provincetown. Yeah, Provincetown. Sorry about that.
Okay.
One of the members was talking about the AIDS crisis and how people didn't have access to treatments, and was really arguing that people should have the ability to access these things on their own terms, and was concerned about drug companies and wealthy companies kind of controlling the market. So they really got into some of those power dynamics, and it was quite fascinating.
Mm. Right. It is instructive when we look back to the AIDS days and how prejudiced things were. And yeah, I hope we can go past that. And Provincetown, for those who don't know, it's probably like the gay capital of Massachusetts in a lot of ways. At least that's how I understand it. I've never been. Can't wait to. We're actually supposed to do breath work there and do some conferences there years ago, but never got around to it. But it's got a deep history with that kind of struggle, so people should learn from that. And yeah, Massachusetts is an interesting place. And yeah, so another thing people might not know is that taxation is super high in Massachusetts, so probably comparable in some ways to California, though I don't know for sure. And yeah, can we really in good conscience raise taxpayer dollars, tax higher in Massachusetts to fund this thing? I think it's incumbent on whoever's putting these things out to try to make this program self-funding and like self-perpetuating, and hopefully maybe a little bit of capital investment, but like let's make sure the wheels can stay on this thing for 5-6 years if you're going to implement this thing. That's my take. Yeah, in Oregon, clearly it didn't fly, still isn't flying. And then in terms of like taxpayer, not having to throw anything down. And Colorado, we'll see. I don't know. I'm super ignorant in Colorado, Mason. They put some sort of media gag order on a lot of the people. So
Yep.
me, with been in the space since 2001, I'm not allowed to talk to these people. So super interesting.
Well, something interesting happened last
mm,
week at the. Um, they're having a lot of meetings this month. They're even meeting next week, which surprised me. I thought they'd take a vacation, but they've kind of the past week, or actually in December, they've really started to consider some critical issues. I think they finally have gotten the like getting to know you part, behind them, and are actually maybe starting to make having some big discussions. But one of the proposals made last week by it was probably the health equity subcommittee. They suggested partnering with some kind of third party payment processor, and PayPal was thrown around as one company, but to allow people who want to become licensees to pay their license fee through this processor. So it'd be like a payment plan. And it struck me that that may have been some way that the state can ensure they get the licensing money now. They maximize, if people can't afford the license and it's $10,000, you can see how this kind of payment plan might bring additional license revenue into the system. But there were people expressing concerns that this could take advantage of people, low income individuals, marginalized groups, kind of because that won't come for free. Of course, there will be some kind of interest or fee charge for that privilege of paying by installments. So I wasn't thrilled about the idea of partnering with, some third party company to do that, but that was approved by that subcommittee last week.
mm, that's super interesting. I wonder why PayPal, like PayPal's kind of beholden to federal laws in some ways. So like I would be looking somewhere else, but most
Yeah.
people in Colorado probably have a PayPal account. Um, Colorado, interestingly, is one of the few states where you can actually pay your taxes in cryptocurrency.
Oh,
So that is an interesting thing. So that could, I don't know, something like a Coinbase maybe, but maybe then there's also risk of like federal kind of coming in because they're trying, Coinbase particularly is trying to be very safe with the feds. So perhaps that wouldn't fly with them. Maybe there needs to be some international operator, but who knows? I'll go ahead and say maybe the government's smarter than me on this one. Uh, right. So anything else on Massachusetts we want to dig into?
well, let's see. So I think something we didn't touch on was that initially New Approach filed these two versions of its ballot initiative. One of them allowed for home cultivation and one did not. So version A and version B. And there was a lot of criticism of that, and people were concerned that they might go with version B that didn't allow for home cultivation. Eventually, they did agree after there was significant pressure from the public and groups like Bay Staters. They did agree to go with version A. But I think we're in this period where decriminalization has an uncertain future, and this is kind of a good segue into California, actually, where Governor Newsom vetoed the statewide decriminalization bill, SB 58. But I would say the future of decrim as a statewide approach is kind of questionable, and I think Massachusetts and perhaps even New England more generally has become kind of a battleground where this is going to be hashed out potentially, because you kind of have these two factions going head to head with a very heavily regulated therapeutic approach versus a more community based decrim approach.
Mm, yeah. So I hear this a lot, Mason. Decrim first. And kind of what they mean is only ever decrim. Um, I got in an argument recently with somebody on stage about mushrooms should never be legalized ever, and I kind of then brought in the larger kind of drug policy harm reduction position of legalize everything, because I've lost too many people. From my friends have lost too many people, and like we kind of even published a piece called "Harming While Healing" about this issue recently by Clayton Ickes, and it's something I really hope the psychedelic world takes seriously. But what are people thinking when they want to implement like a broad decriminalization bill like this and thinking that it solves everything for them?
I'm glad you're asking that because I think there's inconsistency in the way people use the term decriminalization. I think the people you're referring to, the decrim first, um, which is kind of a loosely affiliated group of people, my understanding of it, but that's kind of a broader movement that you shouldn't even think about creating these heavily regulated state programs until you first reduce or eliminate criminal penalties, preferably eliminate, right? So I think that's how most people in the psychedelic space would describe decriminalization. I think of it as reducing or eliminating criminal penalties associated with various activities. And those activities could vary by jurisdiction, and they do. So it could be simple possession and consumption. It could be cultivation at home. It could be sharing. And in different cities across the country, in different states, we see different selections of these activities that are implemented. But and that is initially what Senate Bill 58, Senator Scott Wiener's bill, that's how I think it defined decriminalization, and SB 519 that preceded it. But it kind of morphed earlier this year. So it was introduced in 2021 initially. It included synthetic substances like LSD and MDMA, was eventually pared down to just naturally occurring psychedelics, but it eventually was reduced to kind of a task force, creating a task force. And then it was tried again as SB 58, but it went through some transformations during this year. And I think in the end, what we were left with, which was enacted by both sides of the California legislature, which is quite historic because though I think it was heavily watered down and really morphed into something different than a pure decrim bill at that point, it's notable that we've never seen any kind of decrim make its way through a legislature. That's always happened by ballot initiative because legislators, they get concerned and concerns are raised and things get turned into a clinical trial or, something that kind of get watered down or gutted. So that happened in California. And the ultimate result was that personal use would be decriminalized, personal use by individuals in January of 2025. But first, there had to, so personal use in January 1st, 2025. But group use or sharing, there had to be a framework created by the state first. And so it kind of, what started out as a decrim bill kind of morphed into a therapeutic bill that allowed for potentially for group use in a regulated framework of some kind. But that did pass. The legislature approved it, which is historic. I don't think people really talk about that. Of course, Governor Newsom vetoed it. And I think that the way that he talks about decrim and the way that even potentially Scott Wiener talks about decrim now is kind of more what we mean when we say legalization or regulation, because now Wiener is talking about coming back next year with a therapeutic model, presenting that to Newsom, which is what he called for in his veto. He said that these substances shouldn't be decriminalized before there's a framework that establishes guidelines for dosing and protocols and things like that. So what we're left with now is California is on the path to next year potentially put through the legislature a therapeutic bill, like in the Colorado kind of model that we're seeing take shape.
Um, yeah, it's quite interesting. There's there's so much happening now in California. Aren't there multiple competing bills? Is that right?
Yep, 2 ballot initiatives.
Mm. And we were discussing earlier that as time develops, they look more and more similar. Is that kind of what you're observing?
Yeah, there's 2 ballot initiatives. They're collecting signatures now to be put on the ballot next year. And one of them, Decrim California, which I believe this is their 3rd attempt at a statewide psilocybin ballot initiative. So that's limited to psilocybin, I believe. I heard the campaign director, Ryan Munivar, he was speaking, I think it was at the at Wonderland Miami.
Mhm.
So early November, he said that they had about 1/3 of the signatures they needed. So they need over 500,000 signatures. He said they had 1/3 in early November and they had about 2 months remaining to collect them. The other ballot initiative got a much later start. They were just approved, I think, last month, maybe even early December to start collecting signatures. So they're pretty far behind. I think they have until sometime in the spring. I'm not sure of when their deadline is, but yeah, I was remarking to you before we went live that these ballot initiatives are starting to look very similar. Some of the language is identical. It's pretty clear that they both would decriminalize personal use, and one of them, perhaps both, well, one of them, the more recent one, would create sort of a medical dispensary model, it seems, where patients and their caregivers could go to a dispensary and purchase products, but it also creates a framework for um, the sort of psychedelic assisted therapy type approach. They both do that. I think what's unclear to me is the extent to which either of these protects group use, ceremonial use. They both claim to, and they do include that, but they don't really provide a lot of detail in those areas. So I think that would be the potential concern with both of them, that they make certain claims about spiritual use, religious use, group healing, but they don't provide a lot of detail, and they leave a lot of space potentially for agencies to kind of swoop in and start, filling in the details.
Right. Um, and what is your so a lot of these bills are only looking at a select set of, I guess, naturally occurring compounds. Is there, um, what do you think the kind of talk track is there that makes sense for that argument, or where do you stand on that?
I think it's just pure political strategy on their part. I think they know that once you start
Mhm.
including synthetics, you're going to get a lot more pushback, and that's been illustrated in California by the inclusion of synthetics in the in Wiener's initial bill. So it depends, right? If you're taking an approach through the legislature, it seems like an impossible task to include synthetics. If you have a ballot initiative, it might be viable. You might be able to. I think you might still get some more pushback. There's a lot of language that's put into ballot initiatives, including Oregon and Colorado, and also these new California ones. It's put in there strategically to kind of, they're worried about backlash they might get. And it's very speculative, I think. So I think it's plausible that you could achieve that through. I don't know what my personal position would be, because obviously I think it'd be preferable to decriminalize a broader variety of substances, but I understand that there are certain political realities. I think that's one where people might be willing to, might have to be willing to compromise, but there are other areas where I don't think they should compromise. One is, and I'm baffled by this. California has protection for people who use marijuana from being fired if they're using it outside of work hours. There's protection now. None of these ballot initiatives or legislative, bills put to the legislature have included protection for employees. And in Massachusetts, we know Jared Moffett, who I mentioned from Massachusetts, said that he was sympathetic to that. They wanted to, but it would upset some powerful people within the state. So I guess there are some perhaps companies or maybe organizations that vigorously oppose that. But it seems odd to me to be asking people to take a gamble, on a state program, asking people to come and spend their money in your state on this program and not provide them with just basic protections for their livelihood. That could easily be added to these ballot initiatives. And I don't think most people are going to be upset by that. You might get some groups complaining, but I don't think that's an area where I don't think you should compromise.
Right. Agreed. I think that's a really big thing that could be included, and I haven't not yet seen that. And yeah, I also wonder about things like custody battles, um, and yeah, divorce proceedings, things like that. Like, can these major things in folks' lives be manipulated if you participate? So
I
that's something
believe that
to
is
look at.
in Colorado and Massachusetts. There's kind of a random assortment of protections, like not being able to be kicked off of an organ transplant list or something like that. So these are important, but I think employment affects everyone. It seems like one of the more fundamental protections one could offer.
Mm. Yeah, that would be interesting, looking at this as some sort of just broad category for discrimination if you participate. Uh, I often wonder why people don't kick me out of their houses, even when I know they're kind of like drug policy position. Like, okay, you know what I do, you know what I stand for, and I'm not out of your house yet. It's fascinating. But yeah, like what will happen when there's real consequences on the line for people is a big deal. And I'm glad at least we're thinking about it a little bit, but perhaps we need to be a lot more systematic and make sure there's no gaps or as few as possible in that. Um, now, in California, we're going to have, yeah, kind of the Ryan Monavar initiative, ballot initiatives that we're calling it. And then there's another one, I think, out of San Francisco or Oakland. I'm not sure who exactly is behind that one. Then we
I'll
have the
tell you
Stop
the
Media bill
name.
again.
Well, it's Dave Hodges is one who I
Okay.
know I was watching your interview
Oh, yeah, that was
recently.
wild.
And then it's Reggie. Is it Reggie? Is Harris? Is it Reggie
Reggie
Harris?
Harris. Yeah. Yeah. He does some work with us too.
That's called the Psychedelic Wellness and Healing Initiative. So that's the newer, more recent version. And then the Ryan's is California Psilocybin Initiative.
That's interesting. Yeah, I probably would love to get both parties to debate. I think that would be really interesting, because
Yeah.
it's when ballot initiatives are so close to each other, it is really confusing to the voters to figure out which is which. And in Colorado, we had the kind of really long new approach bill, and then we had the decrim nature single page bill. I read the single page bill. I did not read the new approach bill before it went through. I tried, or maybe I did, and it just took me weeks to get the time to read
It's
16
tough.
pages.
And I think this is a real problem because they get summarized by the media in ways that don't necessarily reflect the actual text. And I should say, I mean, this is a huge difference between these two ballot initiatives. The Psychedelic Wellness and Healing Initiative includes like pretty much all entheogens. So that's a clear difference. It's much, much broader than focusing just on psilocybin. So that would be one point of significant difference.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And is New Approach also having their own fingers in the pot here with like a different one?
So that I wonder about, and I was thinking a lot about how the fall of the TREAT initiative might affect things in California. Might a lot of the resources that were going into TREAT be redirected into either one of these ballot initiatives or the therapeutic bill that's being put before the legislature, or maybe multiple paths, right? Because neither of these are guaranteed. Something could break down in the process through the legislature, whereas the ballot initiatives might have a better chance of passing if they had the resources. So if they had the access to the millions of dollars that New Approach could funnel their way, maybe they actually could get those signatures they need. Without those resources, I think it's going to be really tough for them. But so then you have maybe a higher chance of passage potentially, but at much greater expense, to whoever is supporting the campaign. So I don't know, New Approach's leadership is based in California. MAPS is based in California. So there are a lot of interests. Some of the biggest research centers like UCSF are in the Bay Area. So you have a lot of interests coalescing around this issue for next year. So it will be interesting to see how that breaks down, between the legislature versus ballot initiatives. But right now, I'm not aware of New Approach's involvement in either ballot initiative. It could be.
Mm-hmm. I have a final kind of big question that's super speculative, but let's see where you want to go with it. Like, in terms of helping the most people and harming the least people, what would your kind of ideal approach be here? Considering there's terminal people who could use this quite, in a really serious way now. But how do you like to think about what is more ideal to help people and hurt the least amount of people?
This is a real can of worms, Joe.
Yeah.
I think so. FDA approved treatments are obviously very important. I mean, I completely agree with that. That's, you have to do that. When it comes to state regulated programs, I have become pretty skeptical of these heavily regulated programs based on what we've seen Oregon become and what Colorado is becoming. I just think these things are going to be so expensive for states and for operators and for clients. I'm not sure it makes sense. There are some efforts and discussions happening around how to make these things less expensive. One way is to get rid of these dedicated centers, a service center, $10,000 annual licensing fee. You have this dedicated brick and mortar space. It seems like one of the real pain points of these programs. Now, this came up actually last week on the Colorado Natural Medicine Advisory Board. It's very interesting. We're starting to see some division among the members over certain issues. One of them is home administration. So there's one subcommittee that I would say pretty much opposes home administration. So having a facilitator go to someone's residence and provide services there. And you can see how that could be very important for some people who have a disability. I would think very broadly, doesn't need to be a physical disability. Maybe they have a mobility issue. Maybe they have social anxiety. Maybe they don't want to go to a healing center. So, but there is a group, I believe it's the names are so complicated, but it's like the safety committee, basically, that looks at safety and first responders, things like that. They oppose it. They think it should only be allowed in very, very, very narrow circumstances as kind of an exception. There is another group that I think it's the Health Equity Committee that is arguing, no, this should be a very clearly allowed avenue for the reasons I stated. The cost and the accessibility for people, and they're arguing that facilitators should be able to go directly to a manufacturer for the natural medicine products and be able to bypass a healing center altogether. There was a very interesting discussion that took place last week where attorneys with the district attorney's office or the attorney general's office were pointing out that there's nothing in the statute that prevents that. And so there was this whole debate over whether the advisory board should make a recommendation for rules to be created that clearly allow facilitators to go directly to the source, to manufacturers. And so that's kind of one of the points of discussion and potential conflict that's emerged. But you asked me, about accessibility. I think we probably need to move away from this like dedicated center and focus on education. And I really have come to believe firmly that decriminalization is probably one of the most important things that can be done. I think there are groups all over the country, psychedelic societies, and groups like Bay Staters that are trying to provide education. They do it for free. They try to teach people responsible, practices. And I firmly believe that we don't benefit from criminalizing substances. People become less likely to report, to seek medical attention if something bad does happen. If there are bad actors, guides that are acting unethically, people might be less likely to report them. So we really don't improve safety by maintaining these criminal penalties. I think that communities can do a lot to create responsible environments for people to access. So I guess those are two ways. Just we need to kind of reconceptualize the heavily regulated state model, think of ways to reduce costs structurally. A lot of the discussions on how to increase access are kind of what I would describe as Band-Aid approaches. So having scholarships for certain groups, reducing license fees for certain groups. Yeah, I mean, by all means do that, but that's not, you need structural fixes that will actually significantly reduce the cost, and moving away from the dedicated service center is potentially one way to do that.
Yeah. I think that's important. Yeah. Like whenever there's regulation like this, the cost will go up. So like yeah, I'm broadly in favor of decriminalization, like all drug decrim for sure. And yeah, if we need for political expediency to start with plant psychedelics, great. But we want to be thinking holistically and how is the drug war still hurting people? And then yeah, when we go into these highly regulated state frames, how do we just avoid this like insane inflation on the price due to overregulation? I saw I travel a fair amount. When I go to a state with legal cannabis, I like to actually see what their system is like. And typically, what I notice when a new state has implemented, the cannabis is pretty terrible, or at least products. And then the taxation, the pricing is sky high. It's because their startup costs. They haven't like got into the flow of business. It's not really a competitive landscape yet. And then yeah, and then things develop over time. But they have to deal with so much regulation, and so many people have lost money investing in this whole cannabis space. I would hate to see the same thing for psychedelics. What I would like to see beyond decriminalization is a legal frame where I can actually, get tested product. I know what I'm consuming from a lab. I don't have to trust an individual, and I can hold them legally liable if they sold me something that wasn't what it was supposed to be, with some window of, error, right? Like not perfect necessarily, because what's perfect? It's not like we can put platonic ideals on a label and hold to it. There's a certain margin of error in lab tests. And then can I go sue somebody in a court of law for fraud if they tried to sell me something that wasn't there? So that to me is the next level up. When I chatted with Ethan Needleman from the Drug Policy Alliance around what is the good part of decriminalization, is decriminalization actually helping? And his line was, and this is about all drugs, everybody, this is not about mushrooms, this is all drug decrim, because I know people only want to think about mushrooms these days. There's a lot more drugs than that. So he was saying it allows people to operate more safely. So you can actually implement a safer policy for yourself. You could buy in smaller chunks more regularly, perhaps, or afford testing, or buy in bulk and do testing for you and your friends, things like that. So how do we implement stuff like that? How do states perhaps divert some of their, monies going to prisons and the police to do enforcement to keep us safe instead? And there's actually some intent with some of the health people around me. My county health department is interested in implementing stuff like this, even though it would be illegal. They're interested in implementing stuff like this, so I'm very excited. Yeah,
That's the thing. Decriminalization, you can achieve a lot through that. You can decriminalize pretty much anything, even sales, which has been a line that nobody has yet crossed. But I wouldn't. You could call it gifting with compensation or whatever you wanted to call it. But there's a lot of room for creative, like educational type programming that I think you're alluding to there that could be very effective. I think it's because of the city decriminalization that we've seen across the country that a lot of people feel very comfortable forming these psychedelic societies and having and meeting and educating people and having open dialogue. And I think that's a positive thing.
for sure. Yeah, I believe I was organizing psychedelic events in Boston as early as 2008 to try to get the
Wow.
public a little more educated. It was part of the Evolver reality sandwich thing before whatever happened there happened. And it was quite interesting to be getting people to talk about this in public for probably their first time ever. Like, oh, I went to 3 ayahuasca things in Peru and I've never been able to talk to people, or, all the festival fallout or intentional work or whatever it is. And it was really meaningful. So some of us are more or less risk tolerant, but I think you're right. The decrim bills do allow a sort of permission for people to come together and start digging in.
Yeah, I think what's happened in Oregon right now is that a lot, there are people coming from out of state, sort of a psychedelic tourism industry in Oregon. But a lot of people are saying, I can't afford that and I don't want that. And so they are turning to the underground market. And if you're a regulator, I think you have to acknowledge that and say that, if we're basically, polarizing, the market here and catering largely to people from out of state in a lot of cases. And so, you either want to welcome people into the regulated program by having it be very accessible and open, and or people really are trying to utilize the personal use side in Colorado to provide education and gifting, and I think that's seems to be a pretty powerful way of sharing information, educating people.
Yeah, let's hope the education is somewhat legitimate. I haven't investigated yet, but I've seen a lot of that. And obviously it's still debatable if you're selling education and providing free mushrooms, are you selling mushrooms? Like, that hasn't been tested in a court yet, right? So it's going to take one of those, I think, before we know for sure in Colorado. So please be safe, everybody, if you're going to be doing that kind of thing. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying there could be substantial risks.
Yeah, I think none of anything I say is legal advice, right? But it does seem like there are risks that are inherent in doing that, and people seem willing to. I think they know that. The people I've spoken to are intelligent, and they're willing to do that. And in your interview with Dave Hodges, he acknowledges that there's no protection for them. Basically, they'd have to defend themselves in court. And
in fact, he wants to, which is wild. But I think that's the case we needed, right? We needed somebody with that kind of zeal, I suppose, to test it in courts and see if it can hold up. And I appreciate that about him. I don't know much.
I wouldn't be very optimistic. I wouldn't be very optimistic in that case, unfortunately, because it's typically, I know he claimed that, I mean, I think it's very interesting what they're doing. And he describes some of the kind of doctrine of the church and how they kind of, they see it going back thousands of years, but, the courts tend to look at the tradition, how long, so, a lot of these churches have longstanding traditions going back 100 years plus, in some cases far longer than that. I think that's probably one of the big factors they would look at. So, these newer churches that, I mean, not to say they're any less legitimate, but I think in the cases that we've seen, that's one of the factors that we look at, and also the number of people involved. I think they're pretty big. The Church of Ambrosia, I think, is pretty sizable.
They're gigantic. Yeah, it's kind of shocking, really.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, like from what I understand, Mason, you I think contributed to a series we did a while ago about religious freedom in America, and there was this whole kind of yeah, set of things. Yeah, history of practice. Like, what's your doctrine? Does it seem to make sense? What are your practices? What does getting membership and maintaining membership look like? There's all sorts of things that they would look at. That said, you're applying to the DEA if you're trying to go that route, as opposed to challenging it in a case. And the DEA is not very open with granting these religious groups. Like, do you know where SoulQuest stands right now with their battle?
No. And I was just thinking about, I mean, Dave, they have not applied for anything like that to the DEA, right? They're just kind of like, well, if they come, then we would challenge it, right? Yeah, I haven't. I was following that a little bit, the Soul Quest, but I haven't checked in on it recently.
I'll try to report back. And I think there's some interesting stuff there. Yeah. And there was a new provision for, I'm seeing some comments here. There was a new provision included in the Colorado personal use section, like the decriminalization section around, from what I understand, unlimited mushroom possession for the purposes of testing. So if you're offering testing services, you can possess quite a bit. I would suggest everybody check that to confirm that's in there, and probably check with 1 to 5 attorneys before you go forward. But that it does seem like something very interesting.
I'm not understanding that in Colorado.
That was my understanding. I chatted with allegedly, I forget the gentleman's name. He was somebody who plans to be extraordinarily active in Colorado, but he's out of state, and he claimed to had influenced the bill around testing inside the decrim frame. So if you were going to offer, say, there's 35 growers that are gifting everywhere, you could, as a grower or a consumer, send samples to this place, and their possession, even if it's above personal use amounts, is okay. That's how I was understanding it when he was explaining it to me. But is that not something you're
I'm not
familiar with?
aware of anything like that. Yeah, I have, and I think I've scoured the
You've
amendment
done
pretty
more work than
closely.
me, Mason.
I've looked at SB 290, and I mean, there's a question whether that would fall under harm reduction services.
That's how I think it is framed. Yeah,
But you
because
can't
how
be.
much are you consuming? Like 3 grams doesn't really make sense anymore, given the potency differences.
I think that's the biggest question right now for me in terms of personal use in Colorado when it comes to these sort of harm reduction services. What are they? It's very unclear. I don't think anyone really knows that. But there was an addition added in that amendment that said that spiritual and religious practitioners, they have to inform people they're not licensed facilitators. They can't advertise, and they can't operate on a for-profit basis. So that kind of imposes some constraints, but it's just like you said, no one really knows exactly what the boundaries and the edges are of personal use. And there was a therapist, I think last month perhaps, that was publicly talking about having provided therapy on the personal use side. And that seems like really going out on a limb.
Yeah, people should be extraordinarily careful here, and all over. Yeah, everything from municipal, state to feds could get involved. I remember people taking gigantic risks when Denver went decrim, and some people had some pretty big consequences as a result. And some of my friends in Colorado, more broadly, took some substantial risks and had some serious consequences thrown at them for a little bit there. So people should really be careful. And again, for me, like being able to do this all without hiding, is kind of where I want to see this go. The shadows create the problems when we can't talk about things openly. That's where the predators and bad behavior can persist. So the more public we can be, the more transparent we can be about what we're experiencing as consumers or providers is really big and saves everybody a lot of stress and pain. So including facilitation, testing, clinical work, et cetera. So yeah, I just think we need to keep proceeding here and work towards helping as many people as we can and keeping people as safe as we can, including from law enforcement. Mm. Mason, I think we have to wrap. Is there anything you want to maybe mention? Links to your mailing list or anything like that?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah, people can follow me on Twitter, Mason Marks MD, or my newsletter, my Substack, Psychedelic Week, psychedelicweek.com, and also on LinkedIn. And yeah, check out the recent JAMA article about states' potential conflict with federal law.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. All right, Mason, you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us, and thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been awesome. Until next time.
Thank you, Joe. My pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.